I have been with Microsoft for about a little over 7 years now. I'm a web person. I'm doing a lot of JavaScript, performance tuning, Node.js, TypeScript. As a matter of fact, I will be talking about TypeScript tomorrow. Usually I think it's good to share with you some of the links or contact information. For example, I used to post a lot of those presentation sample code into my blog. It's a pretty long URL. I know you probably won't remember that because I don't remember that either. But if you do a search, Doris space MSDN, normally the top 2 links, one of them is my blog address. And I also do a lot of video training. How many of you heard about Channel 9? So it's like Microsoft's YouTube, technical YouTube. So you find a lot of free resource. So I actually put a lot of training material there as well. You could also reach me on Twitter at Doris T. Chen, as well as my email, doris.chen@microsoft.com, typical email. Okay, so before Microsoft, I was working with Java community for many years. I was a Java evangelist with Sun Microsystems, not Oracle, for about 10 years. So, but overall, I'm a web person. I really like to do another kind of web-related subject, which is bots. So for today's agenda, I haven't got that, but if you check the website, I should be able to post it there. Right? SVCC, there's a website. You could actually see that. All right, so basically, bots, you heard about that. But how many of you think it's just a buzzword? Some of you, right? Because you want to understand, I would assume most of you are web or enterprise developers, right? As a matter of fact, for this particular talk, I'm going to focus on using Node.js to show you the code sample. So, but there's also another implementation which is for C#. If you're C# developers, there's exactly the same implementation for that as well. But I'm going to focus on Node.js for today. But like I said, a lot of people feel this is, what is bots, right? What is really the generic architecture concepts involved? And as a web or enterprise developers, how much stuff I could leverage from my previous experience, right? How much learning curve I have. And then is bots, everything could be bots? We probably develop a lot of web application, isn't it, right? Could all the web application or all the apps, could it be bots, right? So a lot of questions, come out when I first look into that. Same thing. So I'm going to share with you some of the best practice. We actually work with a lot of customers, projects, so that we want to give you some idea, of what you could leverage about implementation. And then most important thing is what we could do with bots, right? So I'm going to share with you all those patterns of bots kind of scenario so that you could make it in real life scenario. So let's get started with. So I always like to look at the big picture, right? The architecture. So a lot of times, you have a lot of toolkit, you have a lot of, say, RESTful calls, but it's only like a little that much there, right? You don't understand how does that fit into the big picture, the architecture picture, which is the most important thing when you first getting to develop any bots. So let's start with the middle. The middle says bot connect service. This is a central piece. This is really like the heart to connect your code with all the channels, right? So look at that. This particular service will actually communicate with both your code, which is basically you have all your bot logic implemented in your code as a web service. So you're basically implementing all the REST endpoint as a REST service. And you're getting all the messages from all the channel, which is from the user, through the bot connect service. And then your bot is going to respond, right? Going to reply with a message. And that message is going to reply back through the connect service as a HTTP post. So basically, the bots, what you look at, your code is basically a REST endpoint. It's a web service. And then by using Microsoft bot a builder SDK or framework, making things quite a bit easier, right? So on the other hand, you have all kinds of channels, right? You have a regular web chat, very common one in the browser. We're going to show you a lot. You have email, you have Facebook, you have the Skype, Slack, as well as some SMS, just very simple thing. And you also have another thing called direct line, which I'll talk about in more detail, why you need that, how we're going to make very good use of that. Now, the other things about this the bot connector service is it's trying to normalize all the messages. Think about that. For you, I just developed my bot code once with all the bot logic. I don't have to worry about what kind of channel I try to get into. How does that happen? Your bot have a bot data schema. Your channel depends on what kind of channel or client you have. You have your own, another set of schema, right? It is the job of the bot connector service. They try to normalize all the messages so that as a developer, we don't worry about what kind of channel we try to deploy onto. We just do the way we do. So you implement it once, and the channel is agnostic to you. So this is really the idea, right? So for example, if you have a really fancy like image cards, right? Nice, gooey, rich client. But when you send it to something like just an SMS, very simple thing, you cannot really display an image card in an SMS, right? So the connector service would say, oh, okay, I'll just grab an image, send them an image with a little URL, right? Simplified. So you could still get a message, but not exactly in the original kind of image call. So this is what bot connect service do. You will see connector is very, very important in your bot implementation. You do a lot of work for you. On the other hand, you could also connect to a lot of Microsoft cognitive services, right? For LUIS, natural language processing, translation, bin translation, vision, face recognition, emotions, speech recognition, all the service, right? All those things. You could also do Azure search and the knowledge-based search, which we will talk about in more detail. So this is you do from cognitive service. But on the other hand, people say, oh, okay, this is a Microsoft bot framework. Does that mean I'm kind of locked into that? Well, as a matter of fact, it doesn't really matter. You could still talk to your favorite service because after all, it's just a RESTful call. It's a service. It's a REST service, and you could call any REST API of your choice. You could connect to any database, right? Of course, you could connect to Azure machine learning database, but any database in the cloud, any infrastructure you want to get data. Any RESTful call you're sort of familiar with or interested to do. So it's really something, it's pretty dynamic. It doesn't really have to say it's just Microsoft bot. It actually will allow you to connect to different kind of service of your choice, right? So I want to emphasize that because there's a lot of confusion there, but this is exactly what we targeted for. Cool about architecture? Very good. Next, let's talk a little bit about concepts you may see. For example, we've been trying to do a lot of work, right? So we start with a command line to give exactly the command, kind of hard, right? You have to know exactly command. We're getting to the menu-driven thing, right? But still, you have to understand how to use this particular IDE, how to go from this particular choice into another one. So thanks to the machine learning, deep machine learning, as well as all the big data, so that we will be able to leverage the natural language processing very easily, meaning we will be able to map our models onto those things, what we call LUIS. LUIS stands for Language Understanding Intelligence Service. So what you do is, you actually have a lot of examples to train, we call utterance. And then really utterance itself, it's like another RESTful API. And then in your utterance, you try to map them into your intents. Intents is like a verb, right? And then you extract some entities from that particular example. So for example, I want to get, say, who is Doris, right? So I want to get a Doris-related information. So get is your intent. Doris is probably the entity you want to extract. But then there's multiple ways to talk about, I want to get a Doris information. You could say, who is Doris? Tell me what you know about Doris. It's a drawing of Doris, right? All those kind of things, it's your utterance. And it's on the back end in the LUIS engine, you could actually mapping that model into your bot later on. And I'm sure there will be some other bot session from us, from Microsoft team. You probably will hear more about LUIS and the bots. So we'll just give a little simple intro in case you kind of wondering what is that. Again, LUIS is represents part of the deep machine learning on the back end. We have a lot of other cognitive servers and so on you could use. Okay, so when you look at the bots, it is actually very similar like any of the web application in that particular scenario. For example, you have a traditional application. You have a main screen, right? And you have a new order screen as well as a product search screen. Doing such a way in very typical B2B, B2C, whatever kind of like those websites, right? And then similar stuff, you could do the same for a bot. You could start with, instead of command screen, we call root dialog. And then we have a dialog, which is just handling the new order, as well as we have a dialog to handle the product search dialog. So it's a similar concept in terms of that particular architecture. Very similar, just like any of the web application, right? So in that sense, it's similar to what you used to do, right? Now, there's a little bit of things that you probably need to be aware in the dialogues. Basically, why we need the dialogues, because all the conversations are organized into dialogues, isn't it? So when you actually do all the conversation, a lot of times you group them by the dialogue. Just like, for example, you talk to your friends, right? You talk about, say, a basketball game. Very nice. All of a sudden, it's not done yet, but your friend jumped to another subject, right? This is what a human talks, right? So in that sense, you probably have to come out with different kind of dialogue. So this is how it works. We actually try to putting all the dialogues into stacks. So meaning you always start with a root dialogue, okay? And then you actually implement, say, I have a login dialogue, as well as I have a product search dialogue. The stack is worked as last in, first out, just like a regular typical stack. So meaning every time you work on, say, product search dialogue, when you've done, you try to actually return the controller into the previous one, let's say login dialogue, and so on, until finally you do go back to the root dialogue. This is kind of like an architecture all the bots need to implement. So it's using a stack kind of fashion. And this is something, when you look at that, you probably want to be careful. It's like, I don't want to have too many dialogues. Otherwise, I have a lot to handle. And just like I said, if you change the subject, your dialogue will still be there, but you have to handle. Maybe change it to another dialogue, and you have to actually initiate a new dialogue or something like that, right? So these are the things you probably need to watch out, because we actually have this kind of architecture diagram called dialog stacks, okay? So obviously, I probably don't have enough room to talk everything, but luckily, we do a lot of better docs implementation so that you could look into docs, microsoft.com/bot framework. If you look at that, there's all kinds of information in terms of introduction to bot, how to get started with that, what are the key concepts, and what is the future plans, how do you design your bots, all those things are there, right? So as a matter of fact, throughout the talk, for a particular sort of topic or subject, I will point you to the right URL, so you could look into that to get more information. Okay, because 45 minutes is really pretty short. Okay, let's talk about a best practice. If you look at that, one of the patterns I want people to really sort of avoid is you ask the user, say, hello, user, how can I help you? That's such a generic statement. Well, there's so many things user has in mind. For example, I talked about LUIS, right? If you try to do some, like 100 different intents or verbs, right, you try to do, and then for each of the intent, you may have 100 different ways to represent it. So if you do the math, 100 times 100 is what? 10,000. You have 10,000 possibility you have to handle in your bots, which is, it's maybe still not cover all the possibility that the user may want, right? So you are kind of like, maybe the user will guess a couple of them. So I want to do a house hunting. I want to listen to a concert. I want to search for some music or musician, right? So the user maybe only use 3% of them, but your implementation, you're going to waste 97% of the code just to cover all other cases that you thought user might want it, right? So this is something, not a good pattern. Right? Overuse of the natural language processing, that's what I mean. So a better one, very simple solution is do a manual-driven manual breakdown, which is we're more familiar with, isn't it? So instead, to give a very generic, how can I help you, right? Then you could actually go into say, how can I help you with a particular event of your choice, stages, all those things, right? Like, for example, if I choose events, I could say, okay, what kind of event you're interested in? If the user choose events, I say music, comedy, film, blah, 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 right? And give the category, and the user just pick one of them, and then go to the next level. Then in that case, you could add more intelligence, right? Next time people search the music, I will actually give them very easy way, say, who is that musician, or what kind of song I'm interested in. So you're doing all those manual breakdown kind of pattern so that you kind of guide through the user into the true intent, their true intent. Hence, you actually will have much control and implement better bots. And this is another kind of like a general pattern you should actually keep in mind. Do not just say, let the user choose whatever they want. It's hard to do that way, isn't it? Right? Okay, a couple of other things. People ask me, say, hey, bots is fun, it's cool, let me implement that. Okay, so for example, you know, a lot of people say, I like to use voice recognition. Nice, very nice. But when you want to reset your password, does that make sense, use voice recognition? You said, please reset my password. They're going to ask you, what's your social security? What's your email? I could verify. And then you give them all these things in voice, and then they will just say, oh, okay, so this is what you're going to set up. It doesn't make any sense, right? You don't want everybody to hear your secret, your password, your privacy data, your credential, right? So in that sense, this is not a good bots by using voice, right? But sometimes people just say, I'm playing a Halo game, for example. It's an Xbox game, right? So I say, oh, this is what you do. Take 3 steps forward, then return to the left, and then do something, right? Please, there is something called Xbox controller you could use to do much better job. Instead of typing in text, in the words, ask a bot to do that, right? So not a good choice to do bots. Another scenario I see that people play chess, right? So just say, okay, why don't we moving my bishop from A2 to D5? I don't know about you guys. I could never do that. I need a chess bot to look at it, to understand what I'm going to do for the chess. I know a lot of people may be good. They could do it in their mind, but not me. I need a chess bot. Right? For this is probably not a good candidate. Right? Use bots to play chess. You probably need a chess bot and then go from there. Right? So I give you some kind of what we call anti-pattern so that you will be understanding, what kind of thing you want to do, and then what kind of implementation would be good for a bot, right? So cool. So you kind of understand what are not a good candidates for bots. So next, let's actually, talk about what might be good for a bot, right? So before that, I was just saying, a couple of things to sort of summarize. Always focus on the actual user experience. If you didn't feel it's a natural conversation, it's probably not a good candidate for bot. This is sort of like your bottom kind of line, your really like the design kind of goal. The other thing is try to use multimedia, images, sound, text, symbol, objects, so that you could actually make your bot more like provide more guidance. You could guide through, things like that. And try not to isolate one. Just say bots could just text. Nobody want to type so much text, right? So for us, we want to do less typing. How many times even doing coding we do copy and paste, isn't it, right? So we don't want to do that much typing. So text, purely text about, in a way, probably not a very good way. Anyway, you could read more design concept to go from that URL. You can have better idea about how to design a good bot. Okay, so next, we're going to actually talk about what will be a good candidate, what are the patterns or scenarios available for bots. And the first I'd like to share with you a very simple one called global handlers. So if you look at that, just like I said, a lot of times a conversation could be jumped from one dialogue to the other dialogue. Nobody says you have to finish that dialogue until you jump onto another dialogue, right? This is human nature. You could not stop people just to say, oh, you have to finish this until we move on to the next subject. No, people just do here, here, there. Okay, so they change topic all the time. So what you can do, one of the pattern we share with you is called help pattern. So you call, or we call global handlers, and get more information doing like for .NET, for C#, or for Node, you have actually different kind of implementation and different kind of API. And then normally what you do is implement something like, do you confirm this order? I want to make sure you don't move on to the next subject or next dialogue. I want to make sure if you confirm this order or not. So give a little confirmation, say yes or no, so that you will get some result or towards the end of that particular, say, this is probably order, some new, it's a new order, right? So you actually want to make sure, enforce people to give you the result. The other thing is very simple menu, like start over, help, or cancel, because you think like this particular user is enter something, doesn't make any sense anymore. It's not on the subject anymore, right? So you use this. So this is a really a particular kind of pattern which we could use, but very useful for you to do your bot implementation called global handlers. Okay, so I'm not really going to spend too much time on that because it's just pretty simple implementation. Next, I'm going to focus on the knowledge base bots. Because why, all the sudden bots and all the AI, all those kind of implementation get into the game? Because we all work with big data, large set of data. Whereas before, when I was in grad school, I couldn't get all the data. When I'm doing reasoning, when I'm doing fuzzy logic, all those things, I wouldn't be able to get it, right? So now it's possible. So basically, all you have to do is, in this case, is try to get a particular piece of information by going through a body of big data, a lot of data in the cloud, data in a database, could be SQL database, relational database, could it be just regular, could it be Cosmos DB, could it be just document DB, or could it be just from PDF, right? But basically the idea here is a body of data you're going to work with. So you could do a lot of event bots. For example, we could have something like, when Doris is speaking tomorrow, right? So things like that, and then you can actually search for, say, the SVCC database and find out what's my speaking slot for tomorrow. Similar idea, right? Who was the speaker at a keynote this morning, right? It's going to do all the search through the database of your choice, right? So this is basically, the idea here is it's a knowledge base bot is something I think is a very real life scenario. Every time we do event bot, help desk bot, contact bots, we all use that. Okay, so it does involve, like for example, in terms of a search, right, for a particular knowledge base bots. So when we look at this particular one, there's few techniques you could do. You could use fuzzy searching, facet filtering. I will give a little more detailed example in my demo. But the whole idea here is this is not a regular web search. We already have first-class search engine, Google or Bing. You could do any search there. But this is something more focused. A user wants a particular search for a particular request, meaning it's not like they're going to go for a web search, look at all the returning response. This is something involve you design a knowledge-based bot. You could prompt them with a question, ask them to modify the question, clarify the question, verify the outcome, and come out with that particular information, that piece of information that that user needs. Okay, so that's a little difference in terms of search web, whereas search-based bots. Okay, so without further delay, let me actually share with you a demo. Which is, let me run the demo first, and then we'll go into the code a little bit to explain that. Okay, so this is basically a musician's kind of search. And then I'm using a Visual Studio Code. And then it's very helpful. And VS Code is available for all platforms. How many of you have tried VS Code? And then just for your information, how many of you are actually doing a lot of like a scripting language related JavaScript, Node, okay, perfect, this is for you. How many of you are doing Java development? Okay, we just add a Java plugin for VS Code, so you could do Java development in VS Code as well. And there's debugging capability, IntelliSense, AutoComplete, everything, APIs there. Okay, give it a try. All right, so for this, I'm going to just do a typical node, start this particular node, the app, right? So the idea here is for node, we use Restify, so that you could actually know all your particular service is actually hosted on using Restify. And then in this case, I'm running locally, is using port 3978. And then when I go this, of course, you could do a little manual testing, but I like to use bot framework Emulator, which is Emulator you could actually use to do a lot of things. Normally, when you register with the bots framework on Microsoft side, there's a username, password. But for this, I just go bypass it because it's a local one. So I just connect it. And then you could see a lot of detail with all the login information. So if I do a hi, right? And then I don't know if you could see it. You could actually see there is something called give you like what would you like to search? But it's not anything, right? I give you two category stuff. One is musician explorer. The other is musician search. So when I do a musician search, basically they will ask you who are you searching for. So I'm going to actually pick my favorite classical musician Mozart. So if we do Mozart, they will actually go through a document DB, which I already deployed onto the Azure. And then I'm using Azure index search, which I'll show you in more detail later on. So basically, everything is in JSON format. So we'll go through the document DB, grab that JSON piece of data, relate to Mozart. This is basically doing a name search. It's like a little kind of like a fuzzy search with a key called Mozart. And then I have the picture of the Mozart, the description, and so on. Right? So this is sort of like just one way to do a musician search. And the second thing we could do is we could do what we call the musician explorer, meaning I want to get into the musician but into different category, right? For example, I have like I'm using Error as my search engine for my facade, right? So you do a facet, you do an Error, then I get back the romantic, classical, blah, 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 all the different category. And when I call what they call facet kind of searching, I also get the number of classical music or number of romantic music associated with that piece. So you see the romantic has 11 pieces, classical has 3 pieces, right? So if I click romantic, meaning I'm actually filtering through all the romantic music, and I'm actually going to present in what we call image carousel. So you could see all those romantic like musicians, listed here in this particular database, right? And then this is basically, the idea to help you to do the facet search, filters, or the fuzzy kind of search, right? These are the basically a few typical kind of search we use for our Azure index search. And this is really show you how we could leverage the knowledge, which is your database. In this case, it's very simple. I just prepare the JSON data for 19, in this case, just 19 musicians, right? And put it into document DB and set up the index to do that. Okay, so you get an idea. This is what it looked like. But what I want to show you here is I want to show you this. This is how I create the Azure search index. So from a document DB, I could very easily add in the particular collection I want in form as a set of JSON data. I imported this. And then what you see here is I could add an index piece. So for the index piece, basically they go to the JSON data, they look at all the what we call field name or the entry from a JSON, right? For example, I want to search image URL. I want to search name, error, description, all those things. I want to leave it as retrievable because these are the information I need to retrieve later on for my bot implementation. And then I could set up for like a filter. For in this case, I only want to go through error, so that I could go through romantic, classical, blah, 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 for the error, which is category of the music, right? So I set up this particular one as a filter so that you could filter through. And also, error is also selected as facetable, because it's a facet I want to go through. Facet meaning you look for that particular data or value inside that. For example, it shows returns as a romantic, I have 11 pieces of musician, and then classical I have 3, blah, blah. These are basically what do you do, facet search. Of course, there's a lot of possibility you could do, but I said this is basically how you actually configure in the search part, so that you could actually search that thing into the database of your choice. Okay. So how many of you like to just get a little idea about the code? All right, okay, so we could do that. So let's actually get into the most important thing is your app.js. So if you never see any Bout framework, basically you use Bout framework. You in Node.js, you use Restify. And then I actually create 2 dialogue. One is a Musician Explorer, one is Search. These are your 2 boxes, right? And, oh, sorry. All right, sorry. Okay, so let me start from the beginning. This is actually, could actually kill this one. We don't need it anymore. All right. So for this is very simple thing for any bot. You need some kind of thing to start as like from a node level. So you, in this case, let me repeat it. You know, we use Restify to implement that. We have 2 different dialogues: Musician Explorer, Musician Search, right? And then you go through the connector, right? We talk about how important as a universal bot, you build the bot. And then you go through, like in this case, I'm using little thumbnail car, right? It's a little car to represent different buttons, so you could choose what is a category you want to see. You want to see Musician Explorer, you want to see Musician Search. And then you register your 2 dialogues inside of this root, you know, kind of like a way, how you connect to the root dialogue, which you always have to do. So you actually do that with all the dialogue ID. You need a trigger action so that when you click one of particular action button, right, it will actually go to that particular dialogue. So that's basically what you do. This is very typical for RESTful. If you do Node.js, this is very typical, and listen to a particular port. Okay, so next is you actually, when you type a particular musician, right, and then you could actually go to the, let me open this, musician search. And what you do is you actually go to a little keyword, right? You give that keyword, like Mozart or whatever, you know, keyword into that, so that you will be able to create a query string. When I'll show you a query string in the next file. Based on the query string, you actually just doing that particular, you could look at it as just a RESTful call, right, to your backend database DB. And then you will be able to choose, you know, to implement the error message and to implement, you know, if it's successful, then I just end the conversation, I getting everything, implement as some kind of musician call, you know, if there's more, then I play more. So this is really for the musician search. And Explorer is a little more complicated because we're actually doing a few like a facet search filter. So we actually handle those particular things inside here so that you could see this is basically, you know, for, I export all the information for that dialogue and handle different errors. And then for each one of them, I'm going through like the facet value, the filter value, you know, I'm getting to that. So it's, you know, it's not too bad. If you look at it, this is about 60 lines of code just to do that. From me, yes, you definitely could do because it's already embedded in the Node.js implementation. So you return as a value, as a promise, then you could handle different things, yes. One thing is I promised you, I said I will show you the query string. This is a query string, all right? So this one will actually give you this is the query string we're working with. You need to give the search name, which is basically your database, Azure search name. What's the name of that? Your index for your particular index search. And then you give a little more detail about search API, you know, the key, it's a key API to do that, right? So that's pretty straightforward. We just leverage all those things. And then on the database side, this is one, I have a knowledge-based search index. And if you look into this on the Azure side, and then you could see this is a database you could search. For example, I could do Mozart, right? And this database will actually create a string called a query string with a search musician named Mozart. And then we'll actually grab the piece of Mozart-related JSON data back for you. And these are the JSON data you actually try to get it and display onto your bot later on, right? So this is what I do on the back end, right? And the other thing is you could do like faucet equals ERA error. This is how I do the search. And then you create a new kind of faucet search string. That's why you could get like a romantic, type. I have 11 cons, classical, I have 3, blah, blah, blah. So this is the back end, how I do it, and so that you could see it. So really, in your front end, in your bot, it's really very agnostic because you just have to work with that query string. And you could have your own query string, maybe not on Azure, maybe something else. That's your choice. But then bot implementation is very much similar. Sounds good? Okay, very good. Let's move on. So I think I didn't realize time, goes so quickly. So, okay, go very quickly. FAQ bot is the most straightforward one. It's a very fancy one. But then because we have a nice tool for cognitive service, so you could go to Azure about, choose FAQ. All you have to do is give a company FAQ kind of URL. And then they will actually convert it into FAQ bot for you without writing any code. All right, so that's pretty good. The other thing is you could, I'm talking about FAQ, all my database kind of search, it's kind of private data, right? But what if you want to do some, search which is on public URL? You could use Bing Knowledge API, which is you just basically just construct that query string. In this case, I want to try to get the bio of Albert Einstein. And then this is basically from who Einstein is, the URL, and all the detail. This is really a public search. Anybody could do that. And it's a variable, right? You could always do it like a RESTful call, right, to do that. So this is another type of knowledge. So a lot of knowledge-related thing, but I think it's a very useful pattern, so I like to spend a little time. So share with you, read more on that particular URL. Another thing which I like to share with you is very interesting. It's called handoff to humans kind of pattern. This is another thing what you do from a tech support. You do that a lot. You have a customer call. You actually get a bot to collect a lot of routine, kind of repeated kind of data, right? Because you probably want to really, say, sort of like no wait in line and to be helped, the bot handle that and all those things. And then you grab some information you need, right? And then you move on to sort of like a simple but a sort of like a repeated kind of solution, right? For example, just say, how can I help you, right? And they said, my computer is not working. All right. So I said, so you may have problem with your computer. Does it power on off? And then the bot will give the yes or no kind of answer. Those are the things, the typical things for us. A lot of time we go for the support, right? Tech support is like we try to skip. So it is true because it's very routine work, right? Any of the technician will get bored. So we could let a bot to handle that. It's all repeated work. So I ask all the routine thing. And afterwards, goes to the interesting part, which is the bot is already getting information, provided some simple solution. Maybe it doesn't help because most likely we call tech support. It's more serious, the question, right? So what we do is how do we handle the complex cases? So sometimes you could just give a message and say, thank you, I will actually getting John to help you further. And then John take over, say, which is the real human being. Say, hey, this is John, and how can we help you? So this is a real kind of conversation goes on afterwards. But there's one thing which is quite interesting, which I thought was to mentioning, is you could actually have a supervised bot to sort of, when doing the human handoff, you could actually try to ask sort of like that supervisor to say, bot says, I've tried all those steps, but the computer seemed like it still wouldn't work, right? So ask the operator, Does that sound like we'll need a hardware replacement? What's next step I should do, right? So give the option, say, maybe I should apologize to user, suggest hardware service, or let me just type something more, right? This is something the supervisor or operator could see. So once the operator confirms, say, oh, I suggest us to request a hardware service, and that would be a good solution. And said, okay, boss said, okay, very good. This is the solution I'm going to offer, and we could take over from there. So this is sort of like you could see it's about when the user for tech support, but at the same time, human actually can get into the game to actually take over from there. So there is a very detailed implementation on this particular URL. If you're interested, you could take a quick look. It gives you the documentation as well as points to the GitHub. All the sample code is on the GitHub, so you could take a close look. Because I try to keep it a little short because it's only 45 minutes, don't have time to go over everything. Okay, so this is something I think worth to spend some time. It's called back channel. Back channel is really cool because if you think about it, we work on a web application. So what if my web application try to talk to a bot? Can I do that? Right? This is a real life scenario. A lot of times we may need to do that. Right? So if you look into that, you will see I would be able to use a particular technique, a channel called direct line API. With that particular one, then you will be able to get in the activities, go back and forth between your bot and your web page. In this particular case, we specify a type of event called event. That particular event is invisible to the user. So user wouldn't be able to see, but it's just a communication channel between the website and the bot. So this is how they could interact with each other. So there's a lot of use case, say getting the GPS, getting the user profiles, or you actually passing the token, right, between bot and also the web page for logging purpose. Or you could actually, advise about for particular user actions and do something like that. So let me just give you some idea how we do that. Let me actually go to my second example. And this is actually using a framework called a web chat framework. I'm starting an HTTP server. So this will be actually hosting a web page. And where is a web page? Let's go to our web page. Okay, it's a web page simple like this. I have a bot, which is embedded in a web page. I have a typical kind of web button, you could play with. So for example, I said, in this case, I type some color, yellow. So, and the bot will take that, right? And sending the yellow as well as a particular event called change background to the web page. And that web page, you say, I get it. You want me to change the color of the background. So boom, it turns to yellow, right? So that's one-way communication from bot to the web page. And on the other hand, web pages say, click this button, click me. And once I click, the message is sending back through the back channel, which is direct line again. And it will say, I see you just pushed that button. Right? So this is a very simple scenario for you to actually work out the communication with a web content versus a bot, right? So kind of running out of time, but I want to show you something which is quite interesting. So this diagram basically just show you like exactly what I did. We have a web channel control, which is allow you to embed that bot, and with a direct line object, which is in the middle. And this object is taking your event, send over to the other party, and vice versa. And then the trick thing is what? The type is called event, so that everything could be done in a back channel way. The user wouldn't have to understand or notice those things. Okay, so another thing to look at a back channel, why it's important is you could, not just a website, it could connect to a device, could connect to a robots, right? You could actually get some heart rate from a sensor, right? You could actually ask the robot to do something. It's all using back channel, same concept. So replace that web page, think about the other device. This is how you do it, right? I don't have time to go over detail, but you could actually go through all the documentation to get a sample code. There's a very similar sample to do that. Now, last but not least is a proactive message. I have a demo, but the whole idea here is if you want to send a notification, if you want to send a reminder to a bot, you could actually implement some proactive message to do that, right? So in the demo next, I will try to show you is actually using service workers. How many heard of that? Fetch API to do that. So what I'm trying to resolve here is it's a problem with what we call bot history. So a lot of times in the web space, right, you may not really get a lot of bot history. So let me actually start from beginning. So I get a hi message, and then I kind of invoke this bot. The bot is just say, I'm a chatbot. This is my notification, right? In this case, I send every 5 seconds. So you don't do that. It's a really real life thing. So if I say I close the bot because maybe it takes few hours, few days, did you lose all the history, all the data you exchange with the bot? No, the history is still there. So if you hit one of those notifications, everything goes back. This is using the cache, fetch, and service workers on the back end. And then obviously, I'm doing a loop to sending those bots every 5 seconds. Of course, I have to stop it. Otherwise, we'll get too much those bots going on, right? So this particular one, I'm actually using proactive messaging because I'm sending all the notification, chatbot, right? And also at the same time, I'm using a different technique to cache all the chat history inside that. And then, yes, you guessed, I have a direct line channel, back channel implemented, so that back channel will actually take whoever is logged onto this web page, is registered with this push notification. And then through the back channel, I actually send push notification back to the website. So actually you see this notification a lot on the website, right? Like Facebook, a lot of other things, you do that. Okay, so I think I'm out of time. I won't be able to show you the code. Let me actually just give you some resources that you could look into. By the way, this is actually the proactive message, kind of like a sample code that you could look into further for those particular one. Okay, yeah. Okay, and next, we just some of the generic one, like how you could build bots, have a dev.bot framework, documentation, GitHub, which contains all the sample code, including some of the sample code I was talking about. And then you could actually go to Microsoft Virtual Academy to get a little intro. So this particular session is kind of, intro, advanced, give the patterns, and not exactly, from like a how to, from baseline step by step. And then for those of you, maybe interested to see what kind of framework is that. So this is actually the bot framework from Microsoft site. You could register, these are the 2 bots. I actually did a demo. So you could register any bot, right? You could create a new bot from there. And then they will actually ask you if you want to do a regular kind of bot without getting on the Azure, or you could actually create a Azure kind of based bots, meaning all the database, all the Azure stuff is getting to the Azure, stored in the Azure, right? So that you don't have to worry about deploy onto Azure. Of course, you don't have to use Azure. So you could choose another one, just leave it as an independent bot and go from there, all right? So I'm really out of time. I really feel I shouldn't this is the last session. You have a lot of things to work on, but I will be staying here a little bit to answer any questions you may have. And with that, thank you very much.